Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with lazy pork dumplings. That's right, making the dough and filling for a dumpling is pretty fast and easy. But the thing that takes a little bit of time and effort is all the shaping and folding and crimping and pleating that goes into making a nice looking dumpling. Which is why I'm very excited to show you a method for making dumplings much faster and easier. And while these might not be as pretty, thanks to the amazing taste and texture, the last thing you're going to be thinking about while you're eating these is what they look like. So with that, let's go ahead and get started with our lazy dough, which is going to be made with nothing more than all-purpose flour, a big pinch of salt, and some warm water. And what I like to do first is give this a mix with a normally sized wooden spoon until it all comes together into a very, very sticky dough ball. Alright, very sticky, as in too sticky to knead. But that is intentional, because what we'll do when it looks like this is get rid of the spoon, and we'll go ahead and transfer in some more flour. At which point we'll switch to our hand and start kneading this, and we will keep kneading, adding more flour if necessary, until we have a soft and supple but not sticky dough. And the beauty of this method is that we're not going to get stuck with a too dry dough. Okay, it's always way easier to knead a little more flour in than try to add some water later. So we generally want to start with something that's too sticky, and then we can work in some more flour a few tablespoons at a time until it's perfect. And that's it. Once we have achieved a dough that's soft but not sticky, we'll go ahead and wrap that with plastic, and then we'll just let it rest out at room temp for about an hour. And yes, of course, if you're going to make this ahead, you can leave it in the fridge. No problem. And that's it. Once our lazy dough's done, we can move on to our lazy filling, which is going to start with some ground pork, to which we will add a whole bunch of crushed garlic, as well as some freshly grated ginger root, followed by a whole bunch of sliced green onions, as well as their little cousin, freshly sliced chives. And by the way, if you get sick a lot, try to eat more garlic and types of onions. They really are helpful. But anyway, we'll go ahead and season this up with some kosher salt, as well as a whole bunch of freshly ground black pepper. And then since I gave Cayenne the day off, we're going to go with some Korean chili flakes. And then we will finish up with a splash of soy sauce, as well as about a teaspoon of sesame oil. And that is going to be it for our filling. We'll simply take a couple forks and mix this until just combined. And as you may have heard me say before, the reason I like the forks is so we're not in here with our hot hands and fingers, which will actually warm up the fat and can make things a little bit tough if you overmix it. And that's it. Once our mixture's been properly forked, we'll go ahead and throw a piece of plastic over that and toss it in the fridge until we're ready to use it. And not just to give it time for those flavors to develop, but it's almost always the case that the colder ground meat is, the easier it is to work with. So we'll pop that in the icebox, as our grandparents used to say. And then the only other prep we can do would be to flavor our chicken broth if we're going to flavor it at all. But I definitely am, with some vinegar and a little bit of soy sauce, as well as a nice big pinch of those Korean chili flakes we used earlier. And technically this step is optional, since we can just use regular chicken broth or stock. But anyway, I'll get into all that later. And the point is here is you can put anything you want in this or nothing. I mean, you are after all the sloth of your lazy dumpling broth. But in case it matters, I really loved how this came out. And then if we want, we can use this right away. But if we're going to make them later, just go ahead and pop that in the fridge as well. And that's it. Assuming we are ready to roll, we'll go ahead and pull out our dough. And I'm going to take about 1/4 of what we made. And on a floured surface, I'm going to kind of roll that out until it's about the thickness of my thumb. At which point we can switch to a rolling pin. And somehow, some way, using just enough flour so it doesn't stick, we'll want to roll this out into a band about 3 inches wide, by however long that is. Okay, let's say like 15, 16 inches. And then one kind of semi-important thing here. Once we have that about the size we want, we should go ahead and dust the surface with flour and then flip it over, so that we're pretty sure the surface underneath is not going to stick once we shape these. Plus, now the side that's probably a little stickier is facing up, which is going to be an advantage when we move to the next step. But to hedge our bets, after we do a little bit of fine-tuning, we'll go ahead and take some nice fresh cold water, plus 1 clean fingertip, and we'll go ahead and very lightly moisten the surface. And we don't want to put too much on. All right, we don't want it wet. We just want it a little bit sticky. And then once that's been accomplished, using the exact same water, we will moisten our fingers, and then use them to transfer on some filling right down the middle of our dough. And as you may know, wet fingers and hands do not stick to meat. So a little bit of moisture on them is going to make this a lot easier. And then once we've transferred the meat on, and evened it out again to about the thickness of our thumb, we will go ahead and fold that dough over along the whole length. And as we do, we'll be sure to press it down, which because our dough is kind of sticky should seal fairly easily. And the whole strategy behind this lazy dumpling method is that instead of forming and shaping and crimping and pleating 16 individual dumplings, we're basically just going to make one really long one and then divide that up into 16 pieces. Which again, while not as aesthetically pleasing maybe, is way, way faster and easier. And then what we can do once that's been completed, if we want, is take our bench scraper, or maybe a pizza wheel, and go ahead and trim off any of the excess. Which, by the way, if you don't mind a little extra dough in your dumpling, is a totally unnecessary step. But personally, I just like the minimum amount of dough needed to hold in all the meat. And then what we'll do before we divide these is dust on a little more flour, and then roll the entire thing so the seam's on the bottom. And that's it. Once that's set, this giant long dumpling is ready to be divided into lots of little ones, which I'm going to do with the well-floured side of my hand, which I will be pressing down very firmly all the way to the table. And for whatever reason, I started by dividing this into 2, and then into 4, and then into 8, and eventually 16. Although in hindsight, it probably would have been even better to start at one end, and then simply karate chop these all the way to the other end. But anyway, I have no regrets. Especially since, as you could probably notice, I was not overly concerned with getting all these perfectly even. And truth be told, once these are cooked, a little variation in size is not going to be very noticeable at all. So I simply embraced their diversity, and I continued on to the last step, which would be to cut these apart with a bench scraper or pizza cutter or knife, or a spatula, or whatever tool you'll think will get this done. And by the way, do not worry if your dough does not seal on the edges. That's totally fine. Okay, so please don't worry about trying to pinch the dough on the ends together. It will not be a problem. And that's it. I went ahead and transferred those onto a plate, at which point we can pop those in the fridge until we're ready to cook them. But I'm actually going to go ahead and cook up a serving now. And what I'm going to do is place those seam side up in a little bit of oil in a pan over high heat. And while you can just steam these or cook these in boiling water or broth, I think by browning and caramelizing them a little bit in the oil first, we get a much more interesting texture and flavor. Okay, so we're sort of borrowing from the old pot sticker method here. So I gave that first side about a minute or two, and went ahead and flipped them over, at which point it's time to pour in our flavored and or non-flavored chicken broth. And then once that's been transferred in, we will cover this and let it boil on high for about 3 minutes or so, or until these are cooked through. Okay, that's really going to depend on how big you made yours. So if yours are bigger and you have to give them an extra minute, go ahead. That is just you cooking. But anyway, mine were done in about 3 minutes. And considering how fast and lazily and ununiform I made them, I thought they looked really good. So I went ahead and pulled those off and transferred them into a shallow bowl, along with, of course, my flavored broth. And by the way, when you do this at home, just go ahead and pour in all the broth. Okay, because I was going to take some pictures, I wanted the perfect level. So I held back about 3 tablespoons, which I have to admit is pretty frustrating to look at. So you go ahead and dump all yours in. And then I went ahead and finished mine up with a little more chili flake and a little scattering of those green onion tops I cut on the bias. And that's it. My lazy pork dumplings were done. So I grabbed a spoon and went in for a taste. And even though these are made with a completely different method, the final result was an eating experience very similar to a classic soup dumpling, which if you're not familiar is a gorgeous pork dumpling that actually contains meat and gelatinized broth inside, so that when you steam them, it liquefies. And when you take a bite, not only do you get the meat, but you get all that luscious broth exploding in your mouth. And since those are usually served with a little bit of soy and vinegar, as I was taking spoonfuls of this, it really was a remarkably similar thing. Plus, these are a little bit safer, because you can really severely burn your mouth with a soup dumpling, as every single person who's ever eaten them will tell you. So I didn't really set out to make a shortcut version of a soup dumpling, but somehow, someway, I accidentally ended up with that. And even though a soup dumpling is not fried first, because the broth inside of those is so much richer and meatier, I actually think that the caramelization here on the dough sort of kind of helped me get that effect. So above and beyond this being an easier, less fastidious method, it really did remind me of eating one of the world's most incredible, and by the way, hardest to make dumplings. But anyway, that's it, what I'm calling lazy pork dumplings. What these things lack in visual beauty, in gorgeous folds and pleats, they more than make up for by tasting exactly the same. Which is why I really do hope you give them a try soon. So head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.